Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Maasrot. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Nishmat Neria ben Tzvedlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Another thing that sets the Maaser obligation is selling the produce. The next several Mishnayot teach when produce that is sold becomes forbidden to snack upon. Today's Mishnah is going to teach us the halakha, the law, for someone who buys produce that is still attached to the tree. The Mishnah says, if someone says to his friend, Helach isar ze v'ten li bo chamesh te'enim. Here is this isar coin, and give me 5 figs in exchange for it, and the figs are still attached to the tree. The Mefarshim explain, Lo yochal ad sheyaser divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, the buyer may not eat those figs even as a snack until he separates Maasrot from them, because selling produce sets its Maaser obligation. The Mefarshim explain, although these figs were not yet processed, Rabbi Meir holds that selling produce sets its Maaser obligation, even if it has not been completely processed, what we call Gemar Melacha. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, however, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ochel achat achat patur. If he eats them one by one as the seller gives them to him, he's exempt from separating Maasrot from them. Vim tzerav chayav. But if the seller combined 2 figs and gave them to the buyer together, he's obligated to separate Maasrot before he eats them. And the Mefarshim explain, Rabbi Yehuda holds that selling produce cannot set its Maaser obligation until after it has been completely processed, what we call Gemar Melacha. Now, these figs are not fully processed since they have not been collected in the basket and covered like we learned in yesterday's Mishnah. Therefore, the buyer can eat them one by one without separating Maasrot. However, like we said, im tzerav chayav, if the seller combined 2 figs and gave them to the buyer together, he's obligated to separate Maasrot before he eats them, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Mefarshim explain, we treat 2 figs together as a small pile. Therefore, 2 fruits gathered together are considered processed enough for selling to finish their processing and set their Maaser obligation. That's only a Chumrah midrabanan, a rabbinic stringency. The rabbis didn't make this decree for single figs because they learned from a pasuk that at least 2 fruits have to be collected together to be considered a pile. Now, the Yerushalmi that the Rav quotes and Mefarshim explain, the Yerushalmi says that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree only in a case where the seller picks the figs from the tree and hands them over to the buyer. However, when the buyer picks the figs, even Rabbi Meir agrees that he may pick and eat them one by one without having to separate Maasrot, as the Rav tells us. The Mishnah continues now. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, I'm going to bring you a proof for my opinion. Maaseh beginat veradim shaita b'Yerushalayim. There was a story involving a rose garden that was in Yerushalayim. Vayu te'enim nimkaron mishalosh u'me'arba b'yisar. And the figs that grew in that garden were sold for 3 or 4 figs for an isar, a coin. They were picked by the owner of the garden and given to the buyer one by one, right? The Rav says the owner did not let other people go into the garden to pick. He was afraid they would damage his rose bushes, the Rav says, so therefore he would give it to them personally. Velo ufrash mimena tiruma u'maaser me'olam, and tiruma and maaser were never separated from the figs of that garden. That shows, the Rav explains, even when figs are sold, they may be eaten one by one without being tithed, because since this is a case where the seller picked the figs, we see that they may be eaten one by one by the buyer without Maasrot being separated, even in the case where the seller is handing the figs one by one, like Rabbi Yehuda says. And that's how the Rav concludes, V'alacha ki Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that one by one, as the seller gives it to the buyer, he can eat them without separating Maasrot, Tumot Maasrot. But if the seller combines 2 figs and gives them to the buyer together, then he's obligated to separate Maasrot before he eats them. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Vav now continues teaching about produce that's bought and picked from the tree. If someone says to his friend, Helach isar ze be'eser tenim sha'avor li, right? Helach isar ze. Here is this isar in exchange for 10 figs that I will choose for myself from your trees. Borer ve'ochel. He may choose figs one by one and eat them as he picks them without separating Maasrot. because since he's taking and eating them before the processing is completed, their maaser obligation did not become set. And like we explained, the Mefarshim explain, in this case, even Rabbi Meir from the previous Mishnah agrees they can be eaten without separating Maasrot, because here it's the buyer who's picking the fruit. Rabbi Meir was only strict where the seller picks the fruit, like we explained in yesterday's Mishnah. Another difference is that in the previous Mishnah, we spoke of buying 5 figs for a dinar, where this Mishnah speaks of buying 10 for a dinar. The reason is because the previous Mishnah speaks of buying from a garden that produces only choice figs, which are more expensive. The reason our Mishnah all of a sudden made 10 figs for 1 isar is because it's speaking of a garden that produces average figs, which are cheaper. That's why the buyer insists, in our case, on being allowed to pick the dates himself so that he could choose the better ones among himself. This is how the Tosfot Yom Tov explains it in the previous Mishnah. Be'eshkol she'avorli, if he says in exchange for a cluster of grapes that I will choose for myself, migarger ve'ochel, he may pick 1 grape at a time from the cluster while it's still attached to the vine and eat it without separating Maasrot. Now, the chidush of the Mishnah, the Mefarshim explain, is that if he wants to be able to snack some of the grapes right away without having to separate Maasrot, he should not cut the cluster off the vine, but he picks off the grapes from it 1 at a time to eat them. If he cuts off the cluster, even 2 grapes at once, he cannot eat what he picked without separating Maasrot, because again, like we learned, 2 grapes together, even 1 cluster that has many grapes, are considered a pile, and they become set for Maasrot by being bought, because that's the Gemar Melacha, that's called finishing off the processing. Birimon she'avorli, if he says in exchange for a pomegranate that I will choose for myself, poret ve'ochel, he may pick out 1 seed at a time from the pomegranate while it's still attached to the tree and eat the seed without separating Maasrot, which the Mefarshim explain. He can break open the pomegranate while it's still attached to the tree and take out 1 seed at a time from it and eat it. Each seed is treated as a separate fruit, therefore you cannot break off 2 at once and eat them without tithing them. Like we explained, 2 at once is already considered a pile. Ba'avatiach she'avorli, if he says in exchange for a melon that I will choose for myself, sofet ve'ochel, he may cut off 1 thin slice at a time while the melon is still attached to the ground and eat it without separating Maasrot. And the Mefarshim explain, although a melon is just 1 fruit, it's too big to be eaten at once. Since it's usually cut up into pieces before it's eaten, each piece is treated as a separate unit. Therefore, you cannot cut off more than 1 piece at a time and eat without separating Maasrot. Now, in this case, the buyer didn't specify in advance which fruits he wanted. He's just asked that he be allowed to check them and pick the ones that he wants. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss where he specified which particular fruits he wanted before he gave the money. Aval im amar lo be'esrim te'anim elu, if the buyer said to the seller, here is this isar in exchange for these 20 figs growing on the tree, not let me pick for myself from your tree. For these 20 figs, bishnei eshkolot elu, or in exchange for these 2 clusters of grapes hanging from the vine, bishnei rimunim elu, or in exchange for these 2 pomegranates on the tree, bishnei avatichim elu, or in exchange for these 2 melons attached to the ground, ochel kedako patur, he may eat them in his normal way, meaning he may pick even 2 or more of them at one time and snack on them, and he's exempt from separating terumot and Maasrot. Mipnei shekana b'mchubar lakarka, because he bought the fruit when it's still attached to the ground, and we know produce that is attached to the ground cannot become set for Maasrot even by being sold. And the Mefarshim explain, it doesn't become set for Maasrot even after it's picked and processed, because since he bought it while it's still attached, he's like the owner of the tree or the field who can pick the produce and snack on it even after it's processed until he brings it into his home. However, in the first case of the Mishnah, where he told him, let me choose for myself, and also in the previous Mishnah, he didn't tell the seller which fruits he wanted to buy. Therefore, even though he gave the money while the fruits were still attached to the tree, the sale didn't take effect until the fruit was picked. Now, selling a picked fruit, since it's Maaser obligation, and it prohibits snacking from it before separating the appropriate Maasrot. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.